Welcome to ESG Decoded. This is Amanda Hsieh, and today I'm so excited to be speaking with Juliana, the head of Houston Incubator and Vice President of Innovation at Greentown Labs. Juliana, we were just having a fun conversation about our last names because we both have maybe difficult to pronounce last names. I'm Chinese, and in Mandarin Chinese, people would pronounce my last name Hsieh. But in English, in American English, we typically pronounce Hsieh. Tell me about your last name. We were having a fun conversation. How do you pronounce your last name in multiple languages?
Well, listen, it starts even with my name first, because a lot of people call me Juliana, but in Spain you call Juliana, right? So a lot of people were like, oh, you know that you don't say Julio Iglesias, you say Julio. And I'm like, guess what? You also say Juliana, right? So I'm very fine with both pronunciation. And for my surname, you have like in Spain, you roll the R, so it's Garay. And then the Z, you pronounce it in Spain, you pronounce it as a TH, like a th. But in Latin America, you pronounce it as an S. So the English way to pronounce it is Garaizar.
Juliana Garaizar.
Yes. Or Juliana Garaizar. That's the Spanish way I pronounce it, but in Latin America, it would be with an S, Garaizar.
Juliana is also based in Houston. I think one of the most interesting things about Houston is the diversity here. And we have people from all over the world, whether you were born here or you're first generation like me, but somehow you find your way to Houston. But let's talk more about Greentown Labs. Will you please tell our listeners who aren't familiar with Greentown, give them a quick overview?
So we are the biggest climate tech incubator in North America. We were created 11 years ago in Boston, where 4 MIT entrepreneurs outgrew their prototyping lab. And what we're trying to do is bring technologies to solve climate change or mitigate the impacts of climate change. So for 11 years, we've already incubated more than 600 companies. And those companies have raised more than $2 billion and created more than 5,000 jobs. So a lot of impact. In Houston, we opened a little over a year and a half ago, and we took over an old Fiesta Mexican food supermarket in the middle of Midtown. And we already have 70 startups after a year. So just for you to notice, it took Greentown Labs Boston 6 years to get there. So we really believe coming to Houston, we came at the right time and to the right place.
What's the difference between the startup ecosystem in Boston versus Houston, or maybe why have a location in Houston?
Yeah, well, one of the reasons for our expansion was we really wanted to have the biggest climate impact, right? And we knew that there was no climate tech convener in Houston, whether in other places like, the West Coast and the East Coast, we already have partners there. So also, in Texas, you have the energy capital of the world, and we wanted to make sure that we actually were starting to jumpstart the energy transition here. So that's the main reason we came over. The biggest differences between the Boston ecosystem and the Houston one is in Boston, we already have a pretty much developed climate tech ecosystem. And, you can see in our campus of 3 buildings there, it's already full capacity, right? We have almost 180 companies there, and there's a wait list. In Houston, the energy transition just started, and there's a lot of new companies, and we have 70 of them here in Houston, but they're still a lot younger, so they are at earlier stages, and that means that they need more help in fundraising, in getting acquainted with corporate partners, with other ecosystem players. So they are a little earlier stage than the ones that we see in Boston. Also, the kind of entrepreneurs we see in Houston, many of them come from oil and gas, so they might be a little more experienced in terms of their careers. They might have been already working for quite a few years in oil and gas, and they've seen a problem that they want to solve, and they might have some money that they've saved from their career to jumpstart this new adventure of theirs in the climate tech entrepreneurship. In Boston, you have quite a lot of PhDs coming from MIT or other companies. In here, you also have some PhDs coming from Rice or Texas A&M or UT, but there's a nice combination of both, a later stage, I would say, professionals with a younger crowd that is pretty interesting.
And you mentioned that you work a lot with corporate partners. Will you talk a little bit more about how you engage or work with corporate partners or the community or other different stakeholder groups?
Yeah, so we came to Houston and even in Boston when we started, we wanted to be a convener, right? We didn't want to reinvent the wheel. So we want to make sure our startups get connected with all the stakeholders they need to be successful. And of course, 80% of our startups have a hardware component. And that's why for them, it's critical to work with big corporations, not only for pilots to test the technologies, but then they need to commercialize it through them. And they need money that they can get from investments from the corporate venture arms, you name it. So we've always found that it was very difficult for them, for a little startup, to get to meet these big corporations. And by us partnering with those corporations, what we do is establish a pathway for them to make it easier to engage. So we're a sort of translator between startups and big corporations. And we have created programs for them, like our sector pitch days, or even some corporate-led acceleration programs, so that our corporations have faster access to innovation, and our startups can access faster also and get to work with them without having to go through all the hurdles that normal companies would have to go to work with big corporations.
And something I think about is that even though, you might be based in here in Houston or in Boston, I'm thinking it sounds like a lot of the corporates that you work with are global companies. Can you talk a little bit about that as well? Is it really just based in the U.S., North American challenges and startups, or is it actually a broader playing ground?
Not at all. Not at all. It's a very broad outlook, and that's the beauty of it. And sometimes, you don't realize how these big corporations are so siloed, right? So we were doing a hydrogen program with Shell a few years ago, and suddenly we were the ones to tell them, that their German counterparts were doing a very interesting program too, and they were like, "Oh, maybe you need to introduce me to these people." And it's like, they're the same company, right? So we find that a lot when we actually work with big corporations, that we are the ones telling them, like, "Hey, by the way, there's another department in another country, or maybe in your same country, that you should reach out to and work in." So yes, I think, fighting climate change has always been a global issue. And I really believe that COVID has even made it more global, right? With COVID, we are an incubator. We were very in-person based, and we had no choice but to become virtual and provide virtual services to our entrepreneurs. That was a great thing because we could provide those services to our Houston entrepreneurs even before we had a building in Houston. So for us, it was a way to convene a community even before we could host them in our new building in Houston. But also our demo day became our Climate Tech Summit. And because it was virtual, we suddenly had 2,500 people who actually joined from 28 different countries. So this became a global affair that, even now that we're back in person to do our Climate Tech in-person Climate Tech Summit, we still want to keep. So we are actually streaming it so that we can still get that global outreach. And many of the companies that have joined us as members lately, both in Boston and in Houston, are actually international companies who are entering the US markets through Greentown. So many of them are coming back and forth. Like we have a few companies from Uruguay and from Italy, and they come back and forth, and we are helping them getting established, but also raising some money and actually hiring their first US people. And we're so glad to be the landing pad for them.
I think that goes to another question I was thinking about, is that we know generally in startups there's a funding gap for women and minorities. And it sounds like Greentown is trying to address that issue. But can you tell us a little bit more?
Sure. So, I personally been very, very big champion for anything that has to do with bridging the gender and the minority gap in investing with, my own funds. And when I was hired by Greentown Boston to be their launch director, the first meeting we got to have was with Wells Fargo. And Wells Fargo, of course, they're very big in DEI. And that's one of the first questions they ask is like, okay, climate tech, that's great. But what about your DEI strategy? And since then, we haven't looked back. That was like a call for us. We put together a DEI steering committee. Then we decided to partner with several very big DEI proponents like Olivia Research Corporation. And we actually did quite a lot of training for our startups in DEI. We received a grant from JP Morgan to actually delve into these. And with that, we could also hire a DEI consultant that would be internal. We also hire our senior VP of people and culture. So not only we're thinking about DEI from the entrepreneurial perspective, but from our own perspective. And one of the big things we are doing now is our Access to Success events. We did one in Boston, and now the next one is going to be in Houston, September 14th. We're going to have our underrepresented funders pitching to a wide set of investors. We're having the head of the chief diversity officer from BP coming over, and many other investors who are interested in this space. We're also partnering with RISE for the Energy Tech Venture Forum. So some of our companies are going to be able to be there and also do their office hours. So we are very excited about that event, and we really think it's going to be only the beginning. We are also just got funding for a new accelerator program for diverse founders called Accel. And we are still fundraising for that. And pretty soon we're actually putting it together, and we're going to announce it for next year. So we care a lot about it. We know that climate change impacts a lot more the underserved communities, and we want to make sure that they are also part of the solution.
Maybe switching the topic a little bit, but I'm curious, from where you sit, what are some kind of the big trends that you're excited about, that you're seeing?
Well, in Houston specifically, there are 4 areas that I'm very, very excited about. Anything that has to do with hydrogen, I really believe that Houston can become a hydrogen hub. So we're really trying to work with everybody. And actually, one of our corporate-led acceleration programs that we do has even gone further, and is the first time we are including a city as a partner to our corporate-led acceleration program. So Hsieh, which is the low carbon hydrogen accelerator program that we have launched, has 4 partners. So Shell, EPRI, Urban Future Labs, and the city of Houston. So it's the first time we add a city to an accelerator program. And it's really because, having Houston as a carbon hub is going to be a challenge that involves everybody. And normally, I would say acceleration programs always think about tech, but in our case, we also need to think about infrastructure and how we put everything together, the demand side to the infrastructure, to the supply chain. And all these things, are not only going to be resolved with tech. Like, we had problems in Silicon Valley and acceleration programs in Silicon Valley that were only about the tech, right? In our case, it's not only about the tech, it's about many other things like making new markets, having a systemic approach, and also all the infrastructure. So we're really glad to have that. And that's a program that I'm very excited about, that was launched a few months ago with the mayor of Houston. That was kind of key. Carbon capture, but even further than that, because I'm really interested in carbon to value, right? You can sequester the carbon, but that's not what you can really do best. It's about what maybe recycling this carbon and what other materials you can do. So the carbon to value program that we have is also with a consortia, what we call our Carbon Tech Leadership Council. It's in its 2nd year, and we have amazing companies that are transforming carbon into other materials, bioethylene, or even diamonds, many other very interesting things. And I love that. I love the bio aspect to it that some of the carbon to value solutions bring. Senvita factory is one of them. They are genetically modifying microbes to actually carbon capture and create bioethylene. So very, very interesting innovation there that actually builds on what we do best, right? We in Houston, we are great at anything that has to do with oil and gas and infrastructure, but also we are very good at biochemistry. And that's something that I'm very excited about. Anything that has to do with circularity, also with chemistry and bioplastics, I think is going to be key, since we're one of the biggest producers of plastics in Texas. So we need to make sure that we add the circularity angle to it. And of course, anything that has to do with the grid is key. We need to make sure, after what happened with Winter Storm Uri, that we have a more robust grid, and that we are really making sure that we make it as big and as efficient as possible. And we have plenty of great companies working on that too. So those are the 4 areas that I'm the most excited about.
And what do you think is missing, or what do we need more of to really accelerate change?
So I would say funding is key. I would say that in Houston, there's a lot of capital, but it's always for later stage projects, right? We have a lot of private equity, family offices. We also have corporate venture arms. In many cases, these companies come at growth stage, and 60% of the technologies that are going to be used to decarbonize the world have not yet been invented. So we need a lot more earlier stage money. Today we still have, I think, ARPA-E came to visit us here in Houston to make sure they understood what projects we were working on, so that they can put together funding mechanisms to help us to bridge that death valley that we have, right? Because till our companies get funded by all these big private equities and CVCs, they still need to get there. So I would say money from grants, ARPA-E, SBA is critical, but also angel investing. We're trying in Houston to activate more. We are very big on angel investing. I used to run the Houston Angel Network for 5 years, and we were the most active network in the US. We need to make sure we educate our members, our angels here, into climate tech investing. And also, I would say we need to make sure that our funds are investing earlier too. And that's already happening. Shell has created an earlier stage seed fund. And also Chevron is putting together their Catalyst program that involves not only grants, but also pilots. Because I would say pilots are all the second thing we need. And I would say sometimes it's a chicken and egg problem with our companies here, right? Because they don't get funding if they don't have a credible pilot, but sometimes for that pilot, they need funding. So we also put together, we have our deal flow digest with information about all the companies and what they're raising and who they're raising from, and if they have a lead or their non-confidential deck that goes to at least 600 vetted investors in our network on a monthly basis. And now we're also creating our pilot digest. So we put out there the pilots that our companies need, because Houston can only really become the energy transition capital of the world if they also become the energy transition lab. We need to be seen as doing things and as risking. And we're pretty soon going to put a wind turbine in our parking lot, and we want that to be obvious, that we're testing new technologies and that we are also trying new things and making sure that they get developed.
I think you hit on the 2 things I was wondering about. It's kind of that chicken or the egg question, right? Is there enough funding to do the pilot? Can you sell the pilot? Do you have a pilot to get the funding? And how do you work that?
Very complicated. So that's why we're trying to. One of the things that we're trying to do in Houston, that's always when you're out of necessity, you always become more innovative. And we're trying to innovate also in finance. We've been trying to finance innovation, but I think climate tech also needs innovation in finance, right?
Yes.
So our companies are not the typical VC backable companies that you see in Silicon Valley. They have very different parts to their projects that, need a very different kind of funding. So some of the pilots could be actually funded by debt. And we actually announced less than a month ago that we actually have a debt fund together with Lacey, Los Angeles Clean Tech Incubator, to fund pilots that could be very hugely de-risked if the pilots are done by with some big corporations. So that's one of the things we're doing. But you can deconstruct a lot of the deals with debt for the pilots with VC, but also some of them could also use project finance because they're going to be developing solar projects or wind projects or geothermal, and these are actually in the project finance realm. So it's I think it's going to be key for us to become more aligned and to make sure that we are having the right incentives to also innovate with a lot of great things in how we fund those projects.
That's something that we're very keen on too, is driving capital to those projects and causes, right? Because everyone realizes there's a lot of money to be made in the transition, but you also need to fund the transition as well to get there. Well, I want to back up just for a moment. And for our listeners who may not understand the difference between angel investing, VC, and PE, will you give just a quick primer on the different stages? So
angel investors, I think, the key is that they invest their own money, right? So whereas a VC fund, a venture capital fund, is basically a fund. That means that they pull some money from what they call their individual investors or LPs, or they could also be institutional investors. And with that money, they actually decide where to invest. So they have a fiduciary duty of governance towards their investors. So the decisions individual angels take regarding on, the criteria for investment are a little different, right? Because it's not the same thing that playing with your own money, where you can assume some risk, than playing with others people's money. So I would say, in terms of criteria for investing, the VC is a little more stringent. They're more fact-based. And with the angels, there's a little bit more of, chemistry with the entrepreneur going on there. A lot of angels may have been entrepreneurs themselves. So they might have actually be successful and sold their companies. And many of them, they want to give back, but they also identify a lot with other entrepreneurs. So if they feel that connection, they might actually ignore other red flags that might be some showstoppers for VCs, just because they feel like, the entrepreneur can pull it off and can actually fulfill what they said they were going to achieve. So a little bit of difference there. Still, I think angels can pull a lot of money. Some of them actually create their own funds, like sidecar funds to the angel group or micro VCs, and still this way are able to get the most of diversification, because of course angel investing in VCs is very risky business. So you need to make sure that you invest at least in 10 companies to make sure that the statistics work in your favor, and you get one of these companies actually giving back the whole return for you. So if you invest less than that, your chances of success are a lot slimmer. So you need to make sure that if you don't have 25K, that is normally the minimum ticket that a lot of companies ask, time 10. So if you don't have 250K available, and considering that this is actually a risky business, you should have more than that for other kinds of less risky assets. The recommendation is go for funds, and there's a lot of funds that have been created by angel groups or micro VCs that have a low ticket investment size. A minimum ticket could be 5K or 10K, and then that's a way for you to start investing and being the change you want in the world. Because I would say there's a lot to be done with us as consumers and also as investors. You don't need to be a Shark Tank, Mr. Wonderful, to be able to invest in the things you want to see in the world. And I think that's key, and that's one of the things we are trying to teach the angel community out here, that there's a lot of good you can do with a little bit of money by impacting the right companies.
Thank you for sharing that. I had also assumed much higher, investments as well. So thank you for sharing that. And of course, we'll link up Greentown Labs and the Houston Angel Network just so people can get more information. But I think it's good to know for other folks who do have some money saved away, maybe, and are wanting to contribute and invest and, put their money to good use. There is a way
So I
of
want
doing
to
that.
make sure you have another one there that you link to. Is
Okay.
Portfolia, portfolia.co.
Okay.
Is actually funds that have been created by women, and they have a majority of women LPs, although of course men are also very welcome, and there's a lot of couples investing, a lot of father-daughter combos of investors too. And we are trying to make sure we bridge the gender and the diversity gap, and we're doing really, really great. So that's also a way. Those are funds. So the minimum ticket size for a portfolio fund is 10K, and you can get to invest in 16 to 20 great companies.
That's really good to know. We'll definitely link up to that as well. Juliana, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. And it's really, I think, just fun learning about, what's happening in Houston. And as you have mentioned so many times, it's really becoming the energy capital of the world to the energy transition capital of the world.
So make sure, our door is open. Make sure you come to our happy hours. We have them on Thursdays, once a month. It's always on our newsletter. So sign up to our newsletter at greentownlabs.com. There's one specifically for Houston, if you're in Houston, but also the generic one. And we'd love to see you.
Sounds good. Thank you.